She walked out of the flames without a tear. The town thought it was over, but it was only beginning. What kind of child walks away from a fire without a tear? In the heart of Oklahoma, Miller's Hollow was a town of whispers. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets festered just beneath the surface. The fields stretched endlessly. The church bells chimed every Sunday, and the diner served gossip with the coffee. Yet cracks ran through the town, small fractures that widened with every unspoken feud and grudge buried under polite smiles. And at the center of it all stood Abigail Prescott. Abby was unforgettable. Her pale skin glowed against the sun-scorched land, her thin frame moved like a ghost, and her unnervingly large blue eyes missed nothing, every sidelong glance, every muttered insult. She lived on the outskirts of town in a crumbling farmhouse with her father, Roy Prescott, a man whose cruelty clung to him like the stench of whiskey. The whispers about the Prescotts were old, almost ritualistic, about Abby's mother, who vanished one night without a trace, leaving behind bruises that whispered their own truths, about Roy, whose temper coiled like a viper ready to strike. But the whispers turned darker after the fire. It happened on a sweltering summer night. The air hung heavy with the promise of a storm that never came, the heat suffocating like a curse. That was the night Roy Prescott fell asleep in his chair, cigarette dangling from his fingers. When the flames erupted, devouring the dry wood of the house, it was too late. The fire claimed everything, the walls, the roof, and Roy himself. Yet Abby walked out unscathed. She stood barefoot in the yard, silent as the flames roared behind her. The firelight flickered in her wide eyes, but there were no tears, no screams. When the volunteer fire brigade arrived, she simply said, "I woke up and ran." Her voice was flat, devoid of fear or grief, her words lingering in the smoke-filled air. The official report called it an accident. The town called it a tragedy. But the whispers, they asked different questions. How had she escaped so easily? Why had no one heard her cry for help? And why did she seem so calm? The questions gnawed at the edges of the town's collective conscience. But Miller's Hollow was a place that buried doubts along with its dead. The church raised funds to buy Abby a trailer, parking it at the edge of her family's scorched property, and deemed the matter settled. Yet the whispers never truly stopped. They never do. Rising unease. Abby's transformation. The fire that claimed Roy Prescott's life should have marked the end of Abby's story, but for Miller's Hollow, it was only the beginning. While casseroles and condolences passed hands, Abby sat alone in her trailer, staring at the charred remains of the farmhouse. Her thin hands rested on her knees, her large blue eyes unblinking. There was no sadness, no longing, just stillness. At school, Abby was a ghost. The other children whispered about her, freak, fire girl, dead-eyed Prescott, but never to her face. Something in her gaze made even the cruelest bullies hesitate. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was worse. It was indifference. When Mrs. Crenshaw, the town gossip, loudly declared at the diner, "The Prescott girl should have burned with that house," the room grew heavy with unease. Mrs. Crenshaw didn't care. Her tongue was sharp, and she took pride in wielding it. Abby heard the words, and she remembered. Mrs. Crenshaw's rose garden was her pride and joy, a splash of beauty in an otherwise bitter life. Every morning she waddled out with her watering can, humming an off-key hymn. Late one quiet night, Abby crept through the bushes bordering the garden. In her hand was a vial of clear liquid, an improvised toxin from berries and chemicals scavenged from her father's shed. She emptied it into the watering can with practiced precision. The next morning, Mrs. Crenshaw tended to her roses with her usual smirk. By noon, she was slumped on her porch, her eyes wide and bloodshot, foam bubbling at her lips. The coroner called it a heart attack. The roses, however, bloomed brighter than ever, deep red, almost bloody. At the funeral, Abby stood in the back of the church, hands clasped, watching as the town murmured false condolences and placed roses, those cursed blooms, on the coffin. She didn't cry or pray, but as the coffin was lowered, a faint smile flickered across her lips. No one noticed. No one ever did. The deaths didn't stop with Mrs. Crenshaw. 2 weeks later, it was Mr. Bailey, the grocer. He pitied Abby, calling her "that poor girl," when he thought she couldn't hear. But Abby had learned pity was just condescension wearing a kind face. On a rainy day, Abby followed Mr. Bailey's truck as he made deliveries on the outskirts of town. She waited until he was inside a farmhouse, then crawled beneath the truck and cut the brake lines with a steady hand. The rain smeared mud on her fingers like war paint. Mr. Bailey drove off unaware, the rain turning the dirt roads to treacherous sludge. When he realized the brakes were gone, it was too late. The truck skidded, fishtailed, and plunged into a ravine, flipping twice before coming to a violent stop. It wasn't an instant death. No, that would have been merciful. He hung upside down, choking on blood and rainwater, his screams swallowed by the storm. When the ruptured fuel line sparked, the fire took what was left of him. By the time help arrived, there was nothing but charred bones and twisted metal. The town mourned, but unease crept in. 2 deaths in 2 weeks. Both accidents that didn't quite sit right. Still, Miller's Hollow was a town of routine, and routine meant moving on. But Abby was just getting started. Her trailer had become a sanctuary of death. On the small rusted table sat jars of powders, tattered books on poisons, and a journal filled with sketches of Miller's Hollow. Red X's marked certain names: Mrs. Crenshaw, Mr. Bailey, and others yet untouched. Newspaper clippings of tragic accidents and obituaries adorned the walls like trophies. Her next target was a school bully, Danny, who had tripped her once, laughing as she fell. Danny loved fishing at the town swimming hole, bragging about the catfish he'd catch. One evening, Abby tied an invisible fishing line beneath the water, securing it to a submerged log. When Danny jumped in, his foot caught the line. At first, he thought it was a cramp, but his annoyance quickly turned to panic as he struggled. The more he thrashed, the tighter the line pulled, cutting into his flesh. His screams echoed faintly in the empty forest, but no one came. When his body was found, his face was frozen in terror, his foot mangled and raw. The coroner called it a tragic drowning. Abby marked another X in her journal. Miller's Hollow began to change. Locks were checked twice, doors bolted even in daylight, church pews filled with desperate prayers for protection. But the deaths continued, precise and deliberate, as if chosen by an unseen hand. And Abby? She walked through the town like a phantom, her pale face betraying nothing, but her eyes, those cold, unblinking blue eyes, held a darkness no one dared meet. Twists in the shadows. The town's fragility. By the time the 4th death struck Miller's Hollow, fear had gripped the town in a suffocating hold. What had once seemed like a string of tragic misfortunes now felt deliberate, a sinister pattern emerging from the chaos. No one dared say it aloud, but the whispers in diners, on porches, and in the dim corners of the church grew louder with every passing day. Something was deeply wrong with Miller's Hollow. When the Jenkins family perished in a fire, the fragile illusion of normalcy finally shattered. The blaze erupted in the dead of night, its glow painting the horizon in hues of orange and red. It started in the kitchen where an old gas line had supposedly failed. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was fully engulfed. Neighbors swore they'd heard the screams of a father, a mother, and their young daughter. But come morning, all that remained were skeletons collapsed into ash. The Jenkins family was known for their sharp tongues. They thrived on gossip, often spreading sly remarks about Abigail Prescott. Abby had once overheard them in the grocery store, Mrs. Jenkins leaning over a shelf to whisper, "That Prescott girl, she's cursed. Mark my words, bad things happen around her." Abby had stood quietly, unseen, her hands clenched into fists behind a row of canned beans. Now, bad things had happened to the Jenkins family. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but one detail lingered like an unspoken accusation. The back door, leading to the kitchen, had been left unlocked. Abby remembered the creak of its hinges as she slipped inside that night, the faint hiss of gas as she loosened the valve. She had stood in the woods, hidden among shadows, watching the flames consume the house. To her, it wasn't cruelty, it was justice. Sheriff Henry Calloway felt the unease more than anyone else. He had seen every body, walked through every scene, and heard every whisper. He couldn't ignore the connections anymore. Mrs. Crenshaw had scorned the Prescotts. Mr. Bailey's pity had felt hollow and condescending. Danny had humiliated Abby in front of her peers. And now the Jenkins family, who had called her cursed, were gone. These weren't coincidences. They were calculated. Calloway had been a lawman for decades. He'd handled cattle thefts, busted meth labs, and once talked a man off the water tower's edge. But this was different, darker. The deaths haunted him, their weight pressing on his chest even as he lay awake at night. The idea of a 13-year-old orchestrating such a string of deaths seemed impossible, yet every lead pulled him back to her. He began watching Abby. Night after night, he parked his patrol car outside her trailer, engine off, his eyes fixed on the dimly lit windows. The property was unnervingly quiet. No music, no laughter, no sign of a typical teenager's life, just the faint glow of a lamp burning late into the night. One evening, he followed her shadow into the woods, his heart pounding as her small frame disappeared into the trees. The woods were Abby's sanctuary. Here, she was free to think, to plan. Calloway followed her as quietly as he could, stepping over roots and branches. Abby moved with precision, leading him deeper until she reached a clearing. Hidden in the brush, Calloway froze as he watched her crouch by the creek. Under the moonlight, her hands worked with meticulous care, arranging something on the ground. Bones, skulls, antlers, vertebrae, all placed in eerie patterns as if forming a language he couldn't understand. Calloway's breath caught in his throat. The sight was unnatural, disturbing in a way he couldn't name. He shifted for a better view, but a twig snapped under his boot, shattering the silence. Abby's head whipped around, her eyes locking onto his hiding spot. For a moment, they stared at each other. Calloway's pulse thundered in his ears, but Abby didn't scream. She didn't run. Instead, she smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of her lips that chilled him to the core. Then she turned and melted into the shadows, leaving him paralyzed with dread. The sheriff's obsession deepened. He pored over coroner reports, mapping the deaths and their connections to Abby. Each victim had crossed her in some way: scorn, pity, humiliation, or cruelty. Toxicology reports showed faint traces of unidentifiable substances. Accident scenes revealed subtle tampering. Every thread led back to her. But Calloway kept his findings to himself, knowing how absurd it would sound to accuse a teenage girl of such calculated acts. The weight of it, however, began to suffocate him. Abby, aware of his attention, found it amusing. She noticed the way his patrol car lingered, the way his gaze followed her at funerals. She saw an opportunity. If Calloway wanted answers, she would give them, on her terms. Breadcrumbs began to appear. An empty vial buried near the creek, a torn notebook page on a park bench, crushed berries outside the sheriff's office. To Calloway, the clues felt like taunts, daring him to go deeper. The town, meanwhile, grew darker with every death. Locks were checked twice. Children were kept indoors. Church pews filled as desperate prayers filled the stale air. But the deaths didn't stop. They came with precision, each one pulling the town closer to the edge. And through it all, Abby walked the streets like a ghost, her face calm and pale, her blue eyes holding a darkness no one dared confront. Miller's Hollow was unraveling, and the strings were being pulled by hands no one could see, except Sheriff Calloway. The spider and the fly, the confrontation. Sheriff Henry Calloway knew the weight of fear. It wasn't the kind of fear that sent a man running. No, this was worse. A slow, gnawing dread that crept in like a shadow, whispering doubts in the dead of night. The clues, the patterns, the deaths, it all pointed to Abigail Prescott. But how could he believe that a 13-year-old girl could mastermind such calculated carnage? Every instinct screamed it was impossible, yet the evidence told a story he couldn't ignore. On a cold autumn night, Calloway decided to confront her. The wind howled through Miller's Hollow, rattling the bare branches of the trees and sending leaves skittering across the ground like fleeting spirits. Calloway sat in his patrol car at the edge of the Prescott property, staring at the dark silhouette of the trailer. The air was heavy, thick with a silence that felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. He'd told no one where he was going. This was his burden to bear. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel. Each step toward the trailer felt heavier than the last, as though unseen hands were pulling him back. The metal walls were streaked with rust, and the windows stared back at him like lifeless eyes. Calloway hesitated at the door, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his gun. A voice in his mind screamed to turn around, to leave this cursed place and never return. But he couldn't. Not after everything he'd seen. The door creaked open under his hand. A foul smell hit him, acrid and cloying like chemicals mixed with rot. He stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The interior was cramped and chaotic, but it was the walls that froze him in place. A map of Miller's Hollow stretched across one side, marked with red X's over the homes of the dead. Newspaper clippings about the accidents and obituaries were pinned beneath it, connected by strands of red string. It was a web, intricate and horrifying, with Abigail Prescott at its center. On the small cluttered table sat jars of powders and liquids, their labels scratched off, alongside open books filled with notes and diagrams. In the middle of it all was a notebook, its pages covered in meticulous handwriting. Calloway flipped through it with trembling hands. The pages were filled with detailed sketches of the town's residents, each accompanied by notes, weaknesses, routines, vulnerabilities. Next to Mrs. Crenshaw's name were the words prideful and nosy, beside Mr. Bailey's condescending pity, and under the Jenkins family, gossipers. The notebook fell from his hands, landing on the floor with a dull thud. His breath came in shallow gasps as he backed away, his pulse hammering in his ears. This wasn't just evidence. It was a confession, a manifesto of methodical destruction. She had been planning this for months, maybe years. A creak behind him snapped him out of his daze. He spun around, flashlight raised, the beam slicing through the shadows. Abby stood in the doorway to the back room, her small frame silhouetted by the dim light behind her. In one hand, she held a flashlight. In the other, something metallic glinted faintly in the darkness. "Sheriff," she said softly, her voice calm and almost sweet. "I was wondering when you'd come." Calloway raised his gun, his hands unsteady. "Abby," he said, his voice rough and strained. "Put it down. We can end this." She tilted her head, her pale blue eyes gleaming in the dim light. "End it?" she echoed, her lips curling into a faint smile. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't something you can end." She stepped closer, and Calloway took a cautious step back, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The air in the trailer felt heavier, pressing down on him like a suffocating weight. "Why, Abby?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Why did you do it?" Her smile widened, though her eyes remained cold and unblinking. "Because someone had to," she said simply. "They were rotten, all of them, pretending to be good, pretending to care, but they didn't. They deserved what they got." Calloway's mind raced as he struggled to think of a way to defuse the situation. He needed to get her out of the trailer, away from the tools of her twisted craft. "Abby, you don't have to do this," he said, trying to steady his voice. "We can get you help. Whatever you've been through, we can fix it." Her expression darkened, the faint smile slipping away. "Fix it," she repeated, her tone laced with quiet fury. "You think this is something you can fix? They didn't fix me. They broke me. All of them." Before Calloway could respond, Abby raised the jar she had been holding, a small glass container filled with a murky liquid. "You want answers, Sheriff?" she said, her voice soft but firm. "Let me show you." With a sudden motion, she hurled the jar to the ground. It shattered on impact, releasing a cloud of noxious gas that filled the room. Calloway staggered back, coughing violently as the acrid fumes burned his throat and stung his eyes. His flashlight slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor and plunging the room into near darkness. He could hear her footsteps, light and deliberate, circling him like a predator stalking wounded prey. "Did you know," she said, her voice cutting through the haze, "that death isn't an end? It's a transformation. It's freedom." Calloway fumbled for his gun, his vision blurring as the gas burned his lungs. Before he could steady himself, a sharp pain tore through his side. He gasped, the warmth of his own blood soaking through his shirt. He dropped to his knees, his strength fading with every passing second. Through the suffocating haze, he saw her face, calm, pale, and eerily serene. She crouched in front of him, her head tilted as she studied him with unnerving curiosity. "You're different," she murmured. "You see the truth. That's why I wanted you to come." Calloway tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His vision dimmed, and the last thing he saw was her smile, a wide, chilling curve that seemed to glow in the faint light. When Sheriff Calloway didn't show up for work the next morning, the town barely noticed. But by nightfall, when his patrol car was found parked outside the Prescott property, unease boiled over into panic. Inside the trailer, they found his body sprawled on the floor. His gun remained holstered, and a crumpled note was clutched in his hand. Written in shaky, uneven handwriting were the words, "It was all for them." Of Abigail Prescott, there was no sign, but the whispers in Miller's Hollow grew louder. The fear, once an undercurrent, now surged through every street and home. Doors were bolted, lights left on through the night, and somewhere in the dark, Abby watched, unseen and unrelenting, her pale blue eyes glinting with the satisfaction of a world in chaos. Miller's Hollow belonged to her now, the ghost of Miller's Hollow. By the time Sheriff Calloway's body was discovered, Miller's Hollow was a town on the brink of hysteria. The people didn't know what to make of his death. Some whispered that the killer had finally silenced him. Others believed it was Abigail Prescott herself, the cursed girl who had brought death to their quiet town, who had claimed him. But one truth united them all. Miller's Hollow was no longer safe. The trailer was abandoned, its sinister contents untouched except by the team of state investigators who descended on the town in the days that followed. They found the map, the notebook, and the poisons, but no sign of Abby. The woods were combed, the creek dredged, and her face was plastered on posters across the state. Yet the girl had vanished, as though the earth itself had swallowed her whole. What lingered were the questions. The note, found in Calloway's hand, it was all for them, became the town's new obsession. Who were they? The victims? The town itself? Or some darker, unseen force that had taken root in Miller's Hollow? Speculation ran wild, each theory more outlandish than the last. But no answer came, only the suffocating weight of fear. Calloway's funeral felt more like a burial for the town itself. The church pews were half empty, the faces of the mourners pale and drawn. They spoke of him as a hero, a man who had tried to protect them, though no one dared speak of what had really happened in that trailer. The truth, like Abby, was a ghost they couldn't face. Fear, after all, was the only thing holding them together. But fear, as Abigail Prescott had learned, was also a tool. Months passed, but the memory of Abby didn't fade. The burned-out shell of the Prescott farmhouse became a place of dread, avoided even by the boldest teenagers. Her trailer, left to rot, stood as a silent monument to the horrors that had unfolded within. But the woods were different. Hunters began reporting strange sights. Shadows moved where no one should be. Bones, small animal skeletons, were arranged in intricate ritualistic patterns on the forest floor. Symbols were carved into tree trunks, their meanings unknown but undeniably eerie. Once, a group of boys dared each other to venture deep into the woods. They returned pale and trembling, swearing they'd heard a girl's laughter echoing through the trees. Then the disappearances began. A drifter passing through town vanished one rainy night, leaving a half-eaten meal and a damp coat behind at the diner. A teenage girl, walking her dog too close to the edge of the woods, never came home. Days later, the dog returned, its fur matted with mud, its eyes wide with unspoken fear. But the girl was never found. Each disappearance brought with it the same murmurs. Abigail Prescott. The state police eventually closed the case after 3 months, citing lack of evidence and no new leads. Officially, Abigail Prescott was a fugitive wanted for multiple murders, though nothing could be conclusively proven. But to the people of Miller's Hollow, she was something else entirely. A ghost, a demon, a reckoning. Life in the town grew quieter, darker. Families packed up and left, unable to bear the weight of the memories. Those who stayed did so out of stubbornness, fear of the unknown, or simple inertia. The streets emptied. Children's laughter, once a common sound, faded into a distant memory. And yet, Abby's presence lingered, as though her shadow had seeped into the soil and the roots of the trees. Years passed, and the legend of Abigail Prescott only grew. Stories were whispered around campfires, the kind told to frighten but laced with genuine fear. They said she still roamed the woods, her pale face glowing in the moonlight, her blue eyes burning with the knowledge of what she had done. They said she watched the town from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. And then, on a quiet autumn night, a hunter stumbled upon something in the woods. Half buried in the dirt was a weathered notebook. Its pages were damp and smudged, but the sketches inside were still legible. Faces of the townsfolk, each marked with a red X. The hunter burned the notebook without telling anyone, but the damage was already done. The fear that had begun to fade returned, sharper and colder than before. Miller's Hollow never recovered. It became a ghost town, not in the literal sense, but in spirit. The people who remained carried the weight of Abigail Prescott's actions in their hearts, a collective guilt they couldn't explain. They avoided the woods, yet couldn't shake the feeling that something watched them from the shadows. Locks were checked twice, doors were bolted even in daylight, and still the woods whispered her name. Hunters and hikers swore they felt her presence, a footprint in the mud, too small for an adult. The sound of faint laughter carried on the wind, and on the darkest nights, when the moonlight cast long shadows through the trees, some claimed to see a glint of blue eyes watching from the depths. Abigail Prescott had become more than a killer. She was the storm that had swept through Miller's Hollow, leaving nothing but ashes and fear in her wake. To some, she was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the darkness that could fester beneath the surface of even the quietest towns. To others, she was a specter, a force of nature that couldn't be contained or understood. But to the town itself, she was something far worse, a reflection, a mirror held up to their own cruelty, their own failures. The gossip, the judgment, the whispers that had chipped away at a lonely girl until there was nothing left but darkness. They had created her, piece by piece, and now they couldn't escape her. Though her body was never found, her shadow remained, a lingering presence that refused to let Miller's Hollow forget. Deep in the woods, where the trees grew thick and the air hung heavy, there were always signs. An intricate pattern of stones, a broken toy left on a stump, a faint trail of footprints leading nowhere. Abigail Prescott had disappeared, but she had not gone, not entirely, and the people of Miller's Hollow knew it. On nights when the wind howled and the shadows grew long, they whispered prayers into the dark, not for salvation, but for mercy, because in the back of their minds, they knew the truth. The past never really stays buried. Love chilling tales like this? Hit subscribe and join us for more spine-tingling stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't miss a single mystery. Turn on notifications now.